All right, everybody, I'm going to go over the comic book industry size today. So, how big do you think it is? And how big do you think indie comics are in comparison to the rest in terms of percentages, in terms of market share? That's what I'm going to go over. And not just indie comics as a broad statement, but specifically crowdfunded comics in comparison to the whole market. Indie comics, if you were to exclude the more mainstream names like Image, Dark Horse, and Boom, and just that category of everyone else, that's what I'm going over today. And it's a lot of numbers, and I'm going to go through it fast, and I'm starting now. Okay? The data I'm going over today is all focused on the North American market, which is essentially the United States and Canada. It all comes from comichron.com, which makes estimations, and then I make estimations, round it out, and make it easy for dummies like myself to visualize. The numbers only include comic shop sales, digital sales, and trade paperback sales in comic shops and bookstores. It doesn't include other media like merchandise or film sales. It's strictly raw, floppy, and book numbers, okay? So, from 2015 to 2020, the annual revenue from comic book sales in North America altogether was $1 billion. To be more specific, it was 1.03 billion in 2015, and in 2020 it was 1.28 billion. It increased only slightly each year, basically on par with inflation. So it probably didn't grow at all in terms of audience base. However, in 2021, the data stated that the industry doubled to 2.075 billion. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but most likely it's because manga sales were lumped into the comic and graphic novel category, whereas in previous years it was probably calculated in the general novel and book market. I just don't see how a jump that big could happen without it totally shaking the industry to the core. Everyone would lose their minds if we doubled in size, okay? We would feel it. And we didn't, so most likely it was just a categorization change. So now that's the overall market numbers. Let's go over the crowd-funded comics numbers, which are not included in the Comichron data because they only calculate sales done through distributors like Diamond and Lunar. All right. Books on Kickstarter and other self crowdfunding platforms are all self distributed, so we have to get the data directly from them. And I only could get data from Kickstarter, so I'm going to round out, sort of do some averages here. So let's just say um, if Indiegogo is roughly about the same as Kickstarter, well, Kickstarter raised $22 million in 2020. And in 2021, they raised $16.9 million just in the comics category. So if you were to assume that they were going to gain another 5% this year, you could probably expect $25 to $27 million to be raised for comics on Kickstarter in 2023. And if you assume that about the same amount was raised on Indiegogo, you could sort of assume that the entire crowdfunded comic market pulls in about $50 million a year. All right. And then if you were to go by the 2020 numbers and assume that the direct market industry size is about $1.3 billion, excluding the manga stuff, and you add in the crowdfunded comic community market size, you could say that the whole industry is roughly $1.35 billion in revenue a year. That means that crowdfunded comics account for less than 4% of the comic book industry. But that's still actually quite substantial if you consider how the other indie comic portions of the market fare in total. In 2020, you can look this up, and Marvel and DC accounted for about 70% of the market share. I call those the whales, the big two. If you go the next level down to the sharks, they account for about 20%, and that's 6 individual publishers: Image, IDW, Dark Horse, Dynamite, Viz, and Boom Studios. And then the final 10% of the retail market, the fish that I like to call, I consider this the true independent comic community, or the true indie comic market. That includes publishers like Titan, Archie, Ablaze, Scout, Valiant, Vault, Sumerian, Massive, Mad Cave, and so on. There's dozens more. If you just calculate that industry size, okay, the fish, That's roughly $180 million a year. If you include that plus the crowdfunded comic market, okay? So that's like 10% of the retail market, 130 million plus the 50 million from the crowdfunded market. You get 180 million a year for the whole indie comics market. By comparison, Games Workshop, the tabletop gaming and toy company that makes Warhammer 40K, they brought in about 170 million in revenue within the United States in 2022. So you could kind of look at those. It's interesting to think about that those are roughly about the same size in terms of revenue each year. As I've said in other videos, the money rises to the top. Okay, it's not evenly dispersed. The whole point of me of explaining all this and going over these numbers is so that you can see that, the top creators take most of the pie, like the 80-20 rule. 80% of the revenue from each publishing house and on Kickstarter and all in total goes to just a handful of comic creators and publishers. And within those publishers, it's going to a handful of creators at that publisher. And on Kickstarter, it's going to a handful of creators on Kickstarter, the majority of it. It's always of the 80-20 rule, the bottom 20%, they're fighting for the nasty lasties. And like in terms of actual dollar numbers, that's basically like $30 to $40 million within the whole grand scheme. And that may sound like a lot, but the competition is fierce. There's almost 3,000 comic projects launched on Kickstarter just in 2022. Funded. There's even more that didn't, launch but didn't fund. If you assume about the same amount were done on Indiegogo, that's about 6,000 comic projects competing against each other. And that's not even including the indie comics released through the comic shops with professional publishers. So even if you were to round down and say my numbers are way off and just say 5,000 units are released each year, in the indie comic market, that's 416 comics per month that the indie comic fans have to choose from. And the indie comic readers also read mainstream comics that they have to choose from. So the competition is insanely fierce. Okay? It's a game of musical chairs, and a lot of us are going to get left out to dry. All right? We'll just be undiscovered and broke. And the whole key to all this is if you want to play in this game, if you want to actually compete, if you want to stand out from the crowd, subscribe to my channel.